who also was on our paper, as you can see. But yes, we have the Masters of Information and Cybersecurity at our program, and some electives with the healthcare informatics. So like we were just saying, this is really about risk management and trying to identify risk in sharing of clinical notes. So just a little bit of a background here. I don't know how familiar, I imagine most of the audience has been to see doctors. Every state in our country, and obviously every geographic location across the world, has different laws. New York State, I think a few years ago, I can't remember what year, they made it mandatory for doctors to share clinical notes with patients. So for the most part, if you go into your apps, if you're scheduling appointments and things like that, you can actually go inside your app. You can actually read the notes. You have to usually click lots of buttons to find your notes afterwards. Some of the notes are in there. They actually have more clinical notes. Doctors write to other doctors, just depends on your insurance and things like that, where if you go see a specialist or do lab tests, there can be additional notes. So New York State is very somewhat progressive over the other states by making it a requirement. There are other states that have this as well, but it's not every state in the country. And different parts of the world, if you're in the EU, you're under the GDPR. And for one of my career jobs, I had to actually look at the different laws across the globe, especially in a place like Manhattan, where we have citizens from other countries who come in here and have health care treatment. They may or may not still be under certain laws from other places. So that has been a requirement in the past. So anyway, I pointed you folks up to go read about 2021, a reference about what you're able to do at the New York Health website. A little bit more too is that there's a lot of data sharing that institutions want to do anonymously, not anonymously, a lot of different levels. At some level, if it's a patient need and patient care, there is it's easier to share data between institutions. If it's more for research and sort of a tangentiary to an immediate physical need for a patient, it's a little harder to share data across institutions. So that aside. So one thing that we actually looked at was trying to look at unstructured text. So the top 3 medical records right now across our United States are Allscripts, Epic, and Cerner are our top 3 medical records. They all have like graphical user interfaces. Some of it is structured text, right? So if they're drop down buttons, radio buttons, even if a graphical, like if it's labeled, so there may be some sort of open text, but it has a label with it. We were actually looking at unstructured text. So these would be like letters between provider and patient care and other kind of unstructured text boxes. And specifically, we wanted to work on this novel problem of looking at sentences. So each sentence inside of these text spaces to see if there's some sort of risk from a point of view of sharing. And having a flag and somehow saying, hey, this is more risky and this is less risky. To our knowledge, we were really not able to find any literature. We looked across a lot of different sources through the libraries and through the Cornell journals and things, through St. John's, more technical journals. And we really weren't able to find anybody who had solved this specific problem with looking at clinical notes and seeing if there's any risk in them in terms of, what we want to share. So we did find 3 other predominantly prevalent domains of research in the cybersecurity space of clinical notes. The first was developing benchmarks. And these benchmarks have historically been used for de-identification. Some of the early CORPA benchmarks go back to the early 2000s. There was a few in the late 2000s from Mayer and al. And AMIA, 2009. with the United States Veterans Association clinical notes. So they developed a benchmark for de-identification. Dellinger also had a public gold standard benchmark with the Cincinnati Children's Hospital. That's 2012. Kumar and all, 2015, had a longitudinal corpus of clinical narratives as well from Texas Health Science Center and the I2B2. And like I said, these were really the domain of literature out there on developing benchmarks for de-identification. Another domain we found as well is de-identification. So that seems to be sort of the focus of a lot of the security, and has a lot of literature. They've done amazing things. They're at very high levels of de-identification. And some of the earlier research is early 2000s, which had some automated de-identification that is sort of built into what we're going to end up using for our study, the I2B2 project. And some of the later, like I said, they keep using the latest and greatest NLP methodologies and other methodologies for de-identification. The third domain we could find related to risk was de-identification of other languages. So there's actually not that much research out there on many different types of languages. You know, as I believe we have over 300 languages across the country, across the world, right? When we were reviewing the literature out there, we found, you know, a wonderful paper that came out for French unstructured narrative, you know, de-identification of French narrative. That's 2017. We also found one for Chinese de-identification, Jian and all, in 2017. They had some other references to Serbian, German, Korean, Portuguese, and Spanish, but very few other languages that we could find. So there's a lot of room to be made in research on de-identifying patient records across different languages. But as you can see, we really couldn't find anything that was looking at sentences in terms of risk and how risky it would be if, for whatever reason, it was exposed at some level. So let's look at the methodology that we used in terms of risk. We had to first find a data set that we could use. Going through IRB process at a hospital can take over a year, especially since COVID has hit. The process has become much slower to get access to real patient data. As a result, we went to the I2B2 project that has now moved into the Harvard N2C2 research data set. And you have to go through their channels and get approval to access the data, explain what you're using it for. That's a long process. Once that gets established, you have access to the data set. We specifically focused on the heart disease data set, clinical notes, that had been purposefully also identified for PHI. So each clinical note, as we'll see here, you can see we can't actually show the clinical notes because the data set's based on real patient data. Even though it's been de-identified, we have to be very careful with the data set. But you can see I've stripped out the actual text from this image, but on each clinical note, it has a set of tags at the bottom that says, hey, there's a risky, there's a PHI, which is a patient health identifier at a certain location in the text. And so you can see each note, there was 514 clinical notes, which parsed out to be about 22,000 sentences across the data set that we looked at. Now, I first did a script to go through and count how many different types of PHI is in this data set. As you can see, there's some biases. There was only one email address across 520 notes, and things like a date had many more occurrences, like around 4,000, close to 5,000 dates in the data set. So you can kind of get a breakdown. There was 11,462 tags in it. And the way we did it, there's a lot more future work here, but we basically said if there's no tags in a sentence, then it's low risk. And if there's more than one or more tags, it's high risk. So we made it a binary, quite like sentiment analysis, positive sentiment and negative sentiment. Well, we did a very similar kind of methodology by saying, hey, the sentence is low risk, or it's high risk. And I didn't have a snapshot here of what risk is, but in general, risk, we never say there's no risk anywhere. Typically, we follow our National Institute of Standards in terms of risk in the United States, which is a low, medium, high scale, a qualitative scale, right? There's other risk models that are out there that are more quantitative. FAIR Institute uses a quantitative scale. A lot of our federal government relies on NIST, so a lot of our healthcare organizations also follow our federal government standards and tend to go with the low, medium, and high. There can be every once in a while like a critical that's usually really reserved for special cases where life is involved, human life, or your DMZ. Sort of your gatekeeper into your network. If those two are typically involved with a serious problem, then you can actually go up to critical. But in general, low to high is sort of the norm across. So as you can see, we had around 10,000 sentences that had high risk, almost 11,000, and close to 12,000 that had low risk in our data set. So the first thing we had to do, nobody had data that was what we needed it to be. So we had to actually go through and clean all of our data first. We basically parsed every sentence of the clinical notes, and I'll get into that in a little while in future work. So we parsed every sentence using the NLTK. And, you know, it was a little bit, the sentences, the way these unstructured clinical notes work is they're not exactly sentences in the terms of like a novel would be, right? A lot of times there weren't periods and semicolons and colons where they should be because, you know, they're sort of written quickly after a patient visit. Also, if they're like a letter or something like that, there's a lot of other headers and things in there that are not typical of a, you know, of a novel. So anyway, there's some room for growth in the future there as well. But what we had to do is after we parse the sentences, then try and go back and figure out where these tags were in the parsing. And depending on how the NLTK parsed the sentence, you know, created some interesting data cleaning problems. And like I said, if we found at least one tag in a sentence, it was given high risk. We actually went through and have done a further study. Some sentences can have up to 20 tags in them. It can get really a lot of tags in one sentence. And sometimes, like I said, if it's a letter and there's a header on it or something like that, there can be a lot of tags in there. So anyway, long story short, we tagged over 22,000 sentences and work on that. So like I said, there may be some room there if something has 20 tags in it versus something that has one tag in it. You know, there's a lot of room there even for risk. So the next things we had to do is look at some of the different embeddings. Now, this is, to our knowledge, one of the first studies that are out there. So we just picked kind of some generic, you know, feature extraction methodologies, count vectorization and word2vec. Word2vec is trained on Google News, again, so that may not be so relevant to clinical notes. They look very different. And count vectorization is number of times a word appears in a sentence. Now, again, because of how unstructured these texts are, that actually was quite success. You know, we saw a lot of success with that just because of how non-standard the texts were. So it was an interesting to look at some of these different two models. We also then classified, used some sort of a classifier to put them into the low or high risk categories. We actually went through the Bernoulli naive Bayes classifier, Gaussian, Eta Boost, random forest, linear SVM, and SVM. And they each have pros and cons to them. SVM is historically one of the most successful classifiers out there on many corpora. And let's talk about our experiments. So our first experiment, like I said, feature extraction, then we try using the count vectorization, right? And then we ran it over the different classifiers. And we did that over all 22,000 sentences, but we trained them on 33% since we have the real tags. And then we also shuffled and cross-validated it. Similarly, with the Word2Vec, same process, but we use the Word2Vec, spacey Word2Vec for the feature extraction, and then also compared them to these different classifiers. And overall, you can see our precision recall and our F1 ratio score. That precision was for bag of words, the Bernoulli was actually the best precision. We always end up at the F1 score, so we can see overall that Word2Vec with SVM performed the best, which is sort of to be expected. But some of these other classifiers and embeddings that we used had, pretty high precision, the Bernoulli with bag of words. And like I said, we kind of stipulated that it was because of the way these clinical notes are structured, that they're quite, kind of random a little bit in the way they are structured. That maybe a larger corpus or something like that is harder to pick up on. But anyway, so overall, our SVM with Word2Vec had the best F1 score overall. And then our confusion matrix, again, this is sort of where we say false positive, false negative, true negative. In our context, we basically say, hey, is something now labeled high risk that's really high risk, right? Is something labeled high risk but is low risk, or is it labeled low risk and it's really low risk? And then actually the worst case that we have in security and data sharing is having something being labeled low risk by our machine learning classifier, but it's really high risk, right? So if we label it, if the machine labels it as low risk, but it's really high risk, that's when sensitive information can get leaked out. We didn't have that. I think that's the top right corner. If it was predicted label was low risk, but the true label is high risk. So we only had about 500 sentences, 550, between 550 and 600 sentences out of 22,000 that would have potentially been leaked in this risky analysis. But again, depending on the laws and things like that, that number you want to see go as close to zero as we can, obviously, because we don't want to be misclassifying things as lower risk when they're not. The other side to that is if something's labeled low risk, or it's predicted to be high risk, but it's really low risk, that basically means we're going to waste time. It's basically saying that, hey, we're saying there's a fire here, but there really isn't. As you can see, we had a slightly higher on that spectrum with about 800 to 1,000 that were misclassified that way, but usually there's no legal ramifications if you, say that it's high risk when it's really not, because then for whatever reason, you might just spend extra work trying to do extra things that there's nothing to do. So those are the two things that we want to see, but we can see that most of the predictions here were pretty good on each side. So again, some of the limitations of the study. We obviously want to look at some of the error analysis and figure out how to make the system more robust. Specifically, there's 3 areas that we could improve. First is the parsing of these sentences. As we said earlier, most of the parsers that are out there, are not really built for the structure of many of these clinical notes. Clinical note structure is going to also depend on your organization and sort of the software and what kind of how they're structuring the information. So that could also still be further improved depending on the organization that it is trying to parse. Again, the feature extraction, there's a lot of work here. There's some graduate students right now who are trying to improve this part to see if there's some better, ways to improve the feature extraction and using some of the more modern feature extractors and also classifiers as well to bring more state of the art. Like we said, this was the first that we could find out there that has looked at it from this perspective. I've spent many, many years in risk management, and that's what we did. We labeled things low, medium, and high to figure out if the organization needed to fix them. So we're sort of moving that risk management now into NLP to see about data sharing from that aspect. So there's a lot of room here for growth. A little bit about conclusions, future work. Some of the interesting things out of this data set from Harvard, they also put in things that are not under HIPAA. So they labeled everything as PHI. We can go back to this. We can go back to, let's see if I can go back a couple here to this data set. But some of these tags here are not under HIPAA, even though the data set at Harvard says they're all PHI. Some of these, like your doctor's name, is not under HIPAA, right? So if clinical notes that just had doctors' names in it get leaked out to alternative marketplaces, right? Or we say a lot in cybersecurity, if this ends up on the front page of the New York Times, well, the doctor, if it's just the doctor's name or something like that, and nothing else, could be a very generic sentence. That in itself is not usually a HIPAA violation, the doctor's name, but the doctor probably will not be happy, right? So there's a lot of risk in terms of reputational damage. So certain identifiers in the Harvard data set are not as risky per se as others. So there's a lot of room for growth here in terms of classifying something like a hospital name, again, is not under HIPAA per se. If like if a hospital name and a generic sentence that doesn't identify a particular patient leaks out, they will not be fined under HIPAA with our Office of Civil Rights. But again, the hospital will probably suffer some sort of reputational damage if things are leaking out and their names are on it, right? So there's a couple things that Harvard put in here into the data set, or the I2B2 project put into the data set, that are kind of unethical to leak, but they're not under HIPAA, but they still classified them as PHI, but they're not exactly PHI in terms of the classical sense of HIPAA. They are more on the ethical side of the house, or reputational damage and things like that. So, I think the two, profession, it could or could not be it, but certainly the hospital and the doctor's name are not under HIPAA per se. So anyway, that also, there's a lot of room coming here to the conclusions. There's a lot of room here for, figuring out different types of things that could be in the text and saying this could be high, medium, low. It's also a lot of room for sort of standardizing across the country, right? Most of the organizations kind of do their own thing. So most of our laws say, hey, you have to do some protection, but they don't tell you how to protect. They do this in a lot of ways. They leave it up to the organization to figure out how to implement it. And that kind of depends on how the organization is structured. But there's a big problem in terms of risk, especially now. I don't know how much folks in the audience are following ransomware attacks that are happening quite regularly across our healthcare sector. Um, and, you know, most these healthcare sectors are under insurance. So a lot of our healthcare entities have big insurance policies that they hold. I've been hearing things in the pipeline right now that, you know, ransomware may or may not be covered. Depends on the policy in cyber attack, right? So anyway, there's a lot of room here for figuring out what's risky and not risky in each sentence per se, but that could also help our country kind of figure out some sort of a standard when it comes down the line to cyber insurance and things like that. So overall, we had Word2Vec with the SVM classifier was the best F1 score. Again, not a high F1 score, but this is one of the first papers. So now there's a lot of room for improvement here. And I think I've already talked about some of the future work. Lots of different areas here in terms of how we want to classify risk. It's sort of like sentiment analysis, right? That's kind of a classical problem, saying a sentence is positive or negative for sentiment. This is in cybersecurity, trying to classify risk and lots of different ways to do that. So again, please, we drew on a lot of different references. So give a brief shout out to everybody that have supported our research here. And I think that's kind of a quick talk today, but I'm happy to answer more custom questions about the healthcare domain and cybersecurity.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Schmelk. I think it's very interesting. I think this is kind of we have started this webinar series from 2.5 years ago, and this is second talk that is actually a kind of intersecting healthcare informatics plus the cybersecurity. And I hope so our audience also have enjoyed the talk. So now, if you guys have any questions, you can just open your mic or you can type, and Dr. Schmelk is here to answer. You can type or you can just open your mic. Anyone? All right, probably I can start with that. You remember last week we were discussing about the part like as you mentioned, PHI and HIPAA. HIPAA is they have 3 to 4 different sections, and not all the sections are relating to the PHI. And so there is a kind of the confusion at this time. That's what you are saying, like they are putting some information under the HIPAA and that's not part of like that. I mean, just like the doctor's name. So, I mean, the demographic information at this time, I was seeing that in the news, especially the people are, the stigmatized about their kind of the illness, as we are discussing, like say a case of an old female with age of over 80 in a certain zip code and have an HIV. So it's easily identifiable. I mean, how many people have over the age of 80 and living in a certain kind of the zip code? So how we can, avoid such kind of thing? And also, I can see there are some kind of the efforts, or you can say kind of the hacking kind of the efforts where they are taking the de-identified nodes and then reversing it back and revealing the informations of the individuals or the groups.
Right. Yeah, that's a huge problem. This is a really big concern, especially being able to go backwards. Yeah, there's been a lot of studies again on that. I've seen, I had to give a talk a long time ago at a conference, and they were talking about geographic location, and it was very common in the day to just move the longitude, latitude, and do that consistently for the data set, and then you can kind of, go back and move around the longitude and latitude and then put everybody back in their original zone, like you were saying. Yeah, this has been a really big problem. I think it's going to get worse. One of the interesting things we ran into in this Harvard data set they've really randomized it. Again, I need to go through carefully, but they've shifted the years. They've obviously renamed the doctors and things like that, but it is their clinical notes. That's why we have to be so careful of like not even putting them on a PowerPoint per se, even though they've been de-identified. There's a lot of problems with de-identified data. Like now I'm trying to figure out risk. And if we've shifted all the dates around, it's hard to see which date is relevant. Like there's birth dates of parents. Like patients will come in and say, you know, my mom was born on this day, or my dad was born on this day. Well, they're talking about their parents' birth dates, so that may not be as risky as the patient's
Mhm.
birth date. Yeah, but you're exactly right. So the de-identification of these things make it really tough then in terms of risk. So we kind of need a pure data set so that to help us kind of figure out what exactly in that data set is risky or not. So trying to go backwards on a de-identified data set and determine the risk is not an easy problem per se. But yeah, you're exactly right. This is a huge concern.
All right. So, any question? Let me see in the chat. Uh,
So I have a question.
okay, go ahead.
Professor, there is no standard pattern for the EHR data, as you explained, different data set from 2000 to 2015. So first of all, how we can solve this problem to have a standard data set? Because the NLP algorithm that you have like discussed here, what to act, and where other one, the Wordwake and other embedding algorithm that you have discussed here. For example, if I'm using that algorithm for 2015 dataset, in the after 2 years, there is another dataset and there has been included new section, for example, COVID-19 section or tag. So how we can generalize this deep learning or these embedding models for the future dataset?
That's a really good, really great question. I was actually working with somebody recently on their dissertation, and they were trying to measure what they're calling drift. And so, you know, this is actually PhD research. This is a great topic because all machine learning algorithms drift with time. It just sort of depends, you know, what the problem is and what it's actually doing. But yeah, so drift is a huge issue across all domains. And, you know, the classical one is if we train it on Shakespearean, right? And then we try and use modern language. Again, the drift there is, you know, that's an obvious drift. Um, but yeah, these are classical problems. I think there's a lot of research in that space per se to figure out if you can tell when your data set is drifting, and maybe you have to, if you have some sort of a flag that indicates, you know, there's a mismatch at that point, I guess what they do in IT is they pull it down, they update it, and they relaunch it. So I don't know, there may be some way to measure, you know, improve drift on the fly so that nothing has to be paused and patched. But yeah, this is a really good question.
Yeah, and also, Professor, other question. I didn't see any slides about the categorization of risk, like high risky tag, less risky tags, medium risky tags. So how we can classify this?
That's actually future work. So
Okay.
everything in this paper was binary. So it's a binary score. It's all low. Or if there's one or more, it's high. Because if you leak one thing out there onto the New York Times, right, versus 20 things out there in the New York Times, a breach is still a breach. So we don't go too much into HIPAA here, but I could actually throw on our website. I don't know if it helps the audience here. Let me see if I can stop sharing this and share my browser for HIPAA and to see if this helps you guys. All right, so HIPAA, OCR, data breach, portal right? So Health and Human Services has high tech was a law that came out a few years ago, I think 2011 or so. And they actually, if you have over 500 patients, 500 or more patients involved, you're publicly disclosed on this portal. Let's see if I can put this find the chat to put this in the chat. But anyway, long story short, you can see what's up here. Here's some of the recent ones. Michigan had 800. This is 414, so about 420, that was last week in Michigan, right? New York, Morgan Stanley had paper. So this is a fun fact. A lot of cybersecurity professionals miss the paper records, right? Because we get so focused on the technical stuff that, whoops, nobody checks the box of paper records that go out the door, right? So this is Morgan Stanley is up here for 500. New York health plan, so anyway, you can come up here. These are very recent. They tell you where it was breached. It was either email, paper, films. That's very kind of unusual nowadays, although a lot of teams forget to look at paper. Network servers, desktop computers, so you can come through here. One thing about this portal, it doesn't tell you what was leaked. So you have to actually then do a deep dive on the internet and say, hey, what was lost? What did Morgan Stanley lose? Was it social security numbers? Was it Visa passport numbers? What did they lose? We don't know. So they don't tell you up here. Now, the other part of the problem they don't tell you up here either is that you go under a corrective action plan. You usually pay the federal government a fine. That's all to be determined. But that action plan stays with the organization. They call it, I think it's called grandfathered. It stays with the organization even if the security team leaves the organization. The corrective action stays with the organization until the end of the time period for the action plan. So I always joke with students sometimes when they get a new job, I'm like, hey, make sure that you're not going into a rabbit hole here. But anyway, long story short, if that helps answer any of your question, going back to our slides, anything that is leaked is a potential breach. And it just depends on how much. So there's a lot of room here. Like I said, we actually did histograms of how many PHI elements are in a sentence. And I think it can be up to 21. So anything from 1 to 21, right? And there's a lot of work there. I mean, are we going to say 5 is the cutoff? So I think actually the binary methodology that says, hey, if there's one or more in a sentence, it make it high. And then if there's no PHI identified in a sentence, it's low. I think that's a pretty good place to start because of the subjectivity of anywhere between 1 and like 20. But yeah, we've spent a lot of time trying to characterize these data sets in more than one way. I hope that answers the question a little bit.
Thank you, Professor, for your detailed answer.
Thank you so much. Yeah. So, any further question?
I had one question for Susanna.
Yes. Yes,
Can you
Professor.
hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Susanna. Thank you for the talk. Great talk. I just wondering about the evaluating the risk, the data set. How they evaluate for example, each vocabulary, each word, or whatever. It can be high risk or low risk. Is it human evaluation or I don't know. Maybe you can explain.
Yeah, definitely. That's a really good question. Thank you for asking. And yeah, so right now we are following HIPAA, and anything that's PHI under HIPAA is considered, you can end up on the data breach, going back over to our data breach portal. So they don't, there is a difference in fine if it's 20 things that are leaked as opposed to one thing. right? But for all of these entities that are up here, I like to go up to see what happened in New York recently. So Morgan Stanley was in New York. Here's Monument, a network server, had 100,000 people involved back on 3/31. So wherever they are, to end up here, like I said, this portal doesn't really clarify. Was it birth dates? Usually it's social securities, credit card information, your license plates. So there's actually 18 identifiers under HIPAA, and we could actually go on Google and see what the 18 PHI identifiers, HIPAA. So there's kind of, this is according to Loyola, the sort of the classical ones that fall under HIPAA, which are address, telephone, fax, excuse the email here, health plan, account numbers. Fun fact, a lot of times the parking deck next to a a hospital, if that parking deck is part of the hospital, then if it's looking at license plate numbers or something like that for when you come in, then those license plate numbers could potentially be under HIPAA. Web URLs, people's email addresses, IP addresses, fingerprints, those are sort of obvious. Biometrics, photographs, a lot of doctors take pictures, dermatologists and things like that take pictures of people. They're obviously all protected. So these are sort of the generic 18.
Yeah.
Harvard put in extra ones like doctors, and they actually referenced in the paper. I went back and read all the papers, and they did that just to have some extra stuff in there. Harvard called it all PHI, but it's not classically HIPAA PHI. Some of them are, some of them aren't. This is a great question because there's no real standard across the country.
Yeah, for example, those are in public domain. For example, our faculty, everything is public, right? Our email, our name,
Right.
plate number. So
Right.
it's
As
gonna
long,
make, yeah.
right. So as long as the doctors don't breach it, as long as it's not coming from your hospital, that's where the cutoff is. So sometimes things show up in the alternative marketplaces and it shows sort of email addresses where it came from that are healthcare. But you're right. So patients can throw that out there,
Yeah,
right?
another thing I want to specifically ask about the medical domain, for example, those notes. So who evaluate those, I don't know, terms in the medical domain that are in the risk, for example, in the term of health, right? So you're reading a note from the doctor, and you say, okay, this patient might be in high risk because of this pattern, right? So how they do that? For example, if it's doctors say that is this type of terms or vocabulary on the high risk, or I mean, you use them, but probably you didn't evaluate them, but you use them for classification. But
Right. Yeah, you bring up another really good point. Um, the way I like to describe healthcare from what I've seen is if anybody watches Formula One racing with the cars, the main deal of car racing is racing the cars, and the IT side is in the pit stops. So the cybersecurity team is usually a pit stop for the healthcare. And so it's sort of up to the medical personnel to stop at the pit stop and involve the security team and say, hey, what's the risk here? They may be able to self-identify. And I joke with my students sometimes and say, here you are, a security analyst, and you're trying to run after the Formula One driver to get them to secure their cell phone. The main game here is treating patients and hoping that they go home alive. That's sort of the business at the end of the day. And no organization really wants to end up on the web, the New York Times. But usually security is sort of a secondary problem to human life. So again, you bring up a really good point. The doctor might kind of recognize that They may be under policies to loop in their cybersecurity team. They may not follow policies because, like I said, the main game there is to treat patients. So sometimes cybersecurity gets lost. But yeah,
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a very interesting topic. We may work together to come up with something.
And
beyond
very interesting discussion as
risk
well.
on the healthcare. Yeah. Thank you.
thank you.
Okay, so here is the question. Our
Hi.
Hi.
We have the two laptops in here because the one on the screen wasn't working. So if I turned mine on, we would have heard,
the echo.
the echo from everything. I just want to say thank you. Thank you so much. This was fantastic. And I appreciate all the questions as well, too. I think this was a fantastic lecture. The work you're doing is so great. And the, the whole aspect of having cybersecurity with the healthcare industry is huge. And this was phenomenal. So thank you so much.
Well, yeah, thank you so much. Let's thank our speaker once more. And I know that how busy the schedule is at this time, but I mean, thank you again for coming and sharing us the very interesting, good research. So before we adjourn, I just want to announce that we are the admissions for MS Healthcare Informatics programs are open now, and we are accepting student by the mid of August. So please look to our page. If you type MS Healthcare Informatics, I will even send you a link in the chat. And please spread the word that we are seeking at this time students, and admissions are open. And this is our online program. No in-person classes. And if you are also interested in research, just contact us, and we'll be happy to engage you in one of our projects. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.